What was a single day like for a man chained to the sands, trained to kill for coin and glory, whose sweat and blood the crowd swallowed without knowing his name and a secret? Follow one gladiator through hidden hours. Pre-dawn drills, whispered bargains, the surgeon's crude hands, lovers hiding in alleys, small rebellions between lashes. I will show their food, training, wounds, faith, the paperwork that bound them, and a secret that flips Rome's story. Stay until the final chapter to see the truth they buried beneath the crowd's roar. But before we dive in, let me know if you're enjoying this kind of long, gentle history. Feel free to tap that like button and subscribe, only if you truly love what I'm doing here. And in the comments, share where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your city. I always love seeing our little bedtime crew gathering from every corner of the world. Now lower your lights, maybe let a soft fan hum in the background, and settle in. Let's ease into tonight's quiet journey together. Chapter 1, Morning Before the Sand. Dawn in the ludus comes like a rumor, soft and immediate. Torches gutter beside sleeping forms, and one man wakes with a practiced count. He tallies breaths rather than stars. Each rise a small ledger of who still lives. A cold stone presses into his ribs, and the air tastes of iron and old sweat. He moves by habit to a corner where the lanista keeps scraps to trade for silence. A crust of bread, a piece of salted fish, an onion traded in the dark becomes secret currency. Outside Rome wakes with bells and merchants, but inside the world narrows to tasks and ranks. Punishments arrive before noise of the streets. Lashes are counted like coins he will never hold. Every small choice in these first minutes is a wager on pain and hunger and a day that may demand everything. A voice orders roll call, sharp as a coin. Names and nicknames tally like debts, more ledger than greeting. They bathe at a cistern with hands thick from chains and crude tools. Older men teach a younger how to wrap a wrist and how to stand to avoid a blade. A trainer inspects shoulders and knees with a hard, quick touch, deciding who will fight. Those chosen are measured for leather, their gear modeled by oil and superstition. A boy from the provinces learns to bow and swallow fear. Men barter again for bread, for a favor, for a day free of extra labor. The lanista watches calculations more than faces and arranges matches like accounts. Training starts while the air is still cold. Wooden swords meet shields in steady rhythm to harden muscle and trim fear. Technique is taught as a language of survival to keep hip and throat away from deadly arcs. Masters correct quickly because a single mistake becomes a man's final account. Repetition carves durable patterns. Shoulders brace, knees learn to bend without giving. Fighters rehearse shouts and stagger in ways that thrill the crowd while masking a tendon that will not mend. Younger men practice falls until pain becomes controlled and less surprising. Trainers sometimes hide wounds to keep a valuable fighter from the surgeon's slow hands. In corners, men trade remedies. A poultice, a hot compress, the name of a useful herb. Trainers adjust armor like dressers, pinning leather to conceal weak spots and whispering choreography between blows. Breakfast is a negotiation in low light and lower voices. Men queue at a trough while a cook ladles barley porridge and bits of salted meat. Portions follow the lanista's math more than hunger. An extra spoonful buys a favor or a promise to take a harsh fight. Some trade watch duty, others offer practice time or a shield cleaned for a week. A few have coins smuggled from fans, small glints of forbidden hope. Stealing happens, and a hidden loaf can feed a sick arm for days. Older men teach the young to stretch porridge with leaves and to hide brine with breadcrumbs. Talk at the trough is business and prayer braided together, plans sketched in whispers. In the ludus, food becomes leverage, medicine, and a quiet measure of loyalty. Punishment ripples through mourning like a cold wind. A man can be singled out for a fault the Lanista calls negligence, or for insolence that stings an officer's pride. Carted into the inner yard, he stands with arms bound while a rod speaks the empire's language. Lashes mark skin and ledger alike. The Lanista notes the debt, and the medicus notes the wound. Punishment is not always about retribution. It is a signal to the others, a demonstration purchased with pain to keep order and to ensure obedience in the arena. Sometimes the punishment is public humiliation instead of blood, standing exposed while comrades avert faces. Those who show fear are assigned harder drills. Those who show defiance lose small privileges like an extra ration. Punishment reshuffles the day's market by shifting who can afford a favor or a bribe. A timed lash can silence mutiny and remind every man of the price of a misstep. Barter governs the morning with a quiet authority. Hands that will hold sword count favors, tallying who owes what. A man will sweep a stable for a loaf, polish sandals for a watch, or agree to face a brutal opponent for another's spare meat. Lanistes and clerks keep small lists, sharp as knives, noting trades in margins and memory. City fans slip gifts through back gates. A ribbon, a few coins, a whispered promise not always kept. Those gifts change probabilities. A coin can buy better bandaging, a ribbon a moment of mercy. Reputation matters. Some men are known as bargains, others as costly risks. The ledger is spoken and seen in nods, pouches passed beneath cloaks, and favors repaid in kind. It runs beside the official accounts and often decides who trains and who waits in a cell for the noon call. Before midday, men perform private rites that look like habit and act like survival. Some smear ash or oil on a forearm, others tuck a charm into a greave. A man with a cracked rib presses a coin at a shrine and asks only for another breath. These acts are not always piety as Rome defines it, but methods of borrowing courage. A medicus moves through the barracks, checking bandages with practiced hands and quiet eyes. He wraps tendons, replaces poultices, and sometimes tells a man to rest if the ledger allows. Better treatment often follows a favor owed or a whispered promise of repayment. Men mend straps and polish helmets, trading stories as they stitch leather and confidence. Friendship is practical and formalized. A protective pact is sewn into cloth and spoken in a nod. Midday brings the summons, armor clattering as men form a line. The lanista calls names while clerks mark them down, and an escort moves toward the gate. Each crossed name lowers a man's ledger and quickens the breath of those left behind. Corridors smell of oil and metal. Fighters practice a steady gait so they will not seem afraid. Parade is also possession. Owners walk beside fighters like keepers showing prized beasts. Fans press forward with ribbons and coins, hoping for a glimpse or favor. A man feels the crowd as pressure that slips into bone before he sees the stands. Editors red faces as if choosing stories, noting who will draw cheers and who might draw blood. The small economy tightens. A whispered bribe can change an editor's eye and alter a match. The noon gate closes and the ludus releases its instruments into the sand. The lanista's ledger governs choice even before the sand is swept. He measures wounds against bets, his standing with senators against the crowd's hunger for novelty. A scar can raise a man's price. A fresh cut can make him expendable. Linistes keep medicus lists and sometimes hold a man to sell his name to another owner. Deals happen with a nod or a coin slipped to a clerk. Matches are investments with bodies as capital. Bravery is a currency, but usefulness is steadier. A fighter known for endurance may be spared a vicious opponent so a flashier rival can draw wagers. The Linistes I calculates which pairings profit him most and cost him least. In the morning those calculations decide who sleeps another night and who will walk into a remembered death. Fans turn mourning into theater of favors and fragile hope. Some bring small tokens or notes tucked into a boot. A ribbon pinned to a tunic can be worth more than a meal and can sway an editor. Lovers pass messages in leather folds and trade glances that will become wagers. A matron's whispered plea can coax an editor toward mercy or a favorable match. Men learn which patrons are dangerous and which are generous, who gives freely and who demands blood. Romances are practical as well as tender. Alliances with well-placed spectators can be lifelines. A gift from a senator's household can buy a medicus or postpone a cruel pairing. These morning exchanges alter the day's script as surely as a trainer's nod, folding private allegiance into public spectacle. As spectacle nears petitions and small papers find hands they need. A man hoping for manumission rises early to seek a clerk, to offer coin that greases bureaucracy. Some draft petitions while others fold into armor and prayer, accepting what comes. Sutures are checked and poultices refreshed for the strain ahead. A medicus lingers over a favored fighter, bending time with a touch that is both kindness and calculation. Offers of manumission are rare, costly, tied to favors that take years to repay. Men measure hope in months and in ledgers of small kindnesses that might someday pay. Even those without hope perform rituals of possibility. A note folded into a coin, an oath to a friend. These acts are currency of faith, fragile but practiced, threading the morning like a map of escape. By the time the sand warms, the morning has already chosen many fates. Barter, favor, and punishment stack like unseen coin. A man shoulders more than armor. He bears debts, stitches, and a comrade's nod. Private details steer the editor and shape the crowd's appetite, turning some names into spectacle and others into forgotten endings. A crust traded at dawn or a bribe by the gate changes the day's arithmetic. Gladiators are made by training and by an economy that prices wounds, gifts, and loyalty. Each small choice, to hide pain, to accept a favor, to give mercy, shifts the afternoon's balance. The ludus grinds private acts into public show, converting tiny mercies into survival or ruin. Understanding morning life reveals the hidden levers that shape every battle. Keep these hidden ledgers in mind as we move into training and theater, where craft will meet cruelty and morning bargains will decide who survives and who will lose everything. Chapter 2: Training, Theater, and Torture. Morning drills begin with a cadence that feels more like ritual than punishment. Under a low roof, men stand shoulder to shoulder while trainers call out sequences and corrections. Wooden swords and padded shields meet in steady rhythm to harden reflexes and teach timing. A young fighter learns to read the subtle change in a trainer's tone because timing keeps a throat whole. Bodies learn to move in predictable ways so that theater can be built upon danger. Each drill repeats until motion becomes instinct, until breathing and stance hold stories that the crowd will later read as courage rather than calculation. Trainers mark small improvements like accountants marking credit and debit. Those marks translate into privileges or punishments at the trough and in the office where a lanista weighs profit over pain. The drill yard is therefore also a counting house, and every precise movement saves or costs a man small mercies he will need before the gates open and the sand takes its due. Masters push men beyond technique into endurance shaped by expectation. Trainers correct posture and calibrate punishment so that lesson and pain fold together. Men run until calves ache and lift stones until fingers numb because pain endured in practice pays dividends in the marketplace of spectacle. The teacher's favor translates into measured leniency in matches and into small privileges at home. Training includes staged sequences where partners rehearse the same choreography until it becomes predictably entertaining, until they can summon a gesture without thinking. This repetition builds a repertoire that protects throats and hearts by making action anticipated, and anticipation saves lives. Yet the same repetition is a slow erosion of surprise and privacy. Men learn to hide tremors and to breathe through old injuries so that a limp shows only when it suits the ledger. In that ledger, stamina reads like credit and failure like debt. Pain is counted and traded in ways that surprise those who imagine the arena only a spectacle. Wounds taken in practice reduce a man's immediate utility yet can be recast as proof of bravery when shown at the right moment. Trainers and owners decide which injuries will be romanticized and which will ruin a fighter's market price. The medicus calculates whether a tendon will heal enough to return a fighter to profitable exhibitions or whether an injury will leave a lasting liability. Men learn to conceal limps and to time the revealing of pain so that sympathy or fear will work for them rather than against them. Hiding an ache might win another match and another ration, but it might also cause a tendon to snap at the worst possible moment. Thus, pain becomes a strategic resource, a currency to be spent and conserved, and the choices about it are rarely simple or purely personal. Costume and persona matter almost as much as a sharpened point. Owners and trainers craft identities from bodies, dressing a man as foreign, noble, or savage to stimulate interest and betting. A crested helmet, a distinctive shield motif, and a favored stance become trademarks the public learns to read. Drills emphasize signature moves and gestures that reinforce those personae and help a crowd interpret risk as narrative. In the ludus, a man learns not only to strike but to perform a character convincingly, to surrender or rage at the right beat so editors in the stands can shape the day's story. That performance protects the man when the crowd favors him and exposes him when they tire of his act. Persona sells, and a reliably performed role can buy a man mercy, a better surgeon, or a pause in punishment. The body becomes both instrument and billboard in a commerce of image and injury. Rumor functions as a quiet currency that moves faster than written orders inside the practice halls. Whispers of a senator's wager, a lanista's displeasure, or a trainer's new favorite can alter the calculus of risk and opportunity. Men listen to motive and origin because a hint can warn of a cruel pairing or signal a chance for mercy. Owners and trainers sometimes seed gossip deliberately to test loyalty or to shepherd the market toward a profitable spectacle. A well-timed whisper can raise a man's price or sink a rival's prospects by changing who bets on whom. Rumor also spreads practical intelligence. Which medicus favors which liniment, which gladiator bears a weak knee, which editor prefers theatrics over raw blood. Knowing what is said and who says it can be the difference between stepping into a favorable match and walking into a death planned by other people's appetites. Discipline is maintained through rituals that alternate instruction with punishment until the two are nearly indistinguishable. A misstep in form brings extra rounds in the yard. An insolent word earns public admonishment meant to shame and correct. Trainers calibrate sanctions to preserve order and to make men reliable performers for editors and paying patrons. Favoritism warps this system, granting leniency to those owners prefer and harshness to those they do not. That imbalance creates incentives and grudges, shaping behavior through a mixture of fear and hope. Discipline is also theatrical. A public correction reassures the crowd that order holds and that owners control the narrative. Men learn to bend under this authority because bending preserves the small securities they need: extra food, a better bed, a surgeon's attention. Deception is a formal lesson because misdirection saves lives and sells tickets. Trainers teach feints, staged retreats, and gestures that mislead an opponent and inspire the crowd. A practiced misstep invites a killing blow that looks like cunning rather than cruelty, and a timed retreat can lure an enemy into a trap scripted for maximum drama. Men practice breath control and measured sound so that pain can be hidden until it suits the ledger. This theater of deceit extends beyond the sand because hiding weakness offstage can secure food, favor, or a less brutal assignment. Deception becomes a survival strategy that is moral only within the strict terms of the ludus. It protects the man from immediate harm while binding him to performances that must be maintained without revealing the true state of his body. Injuries speak a language inside the ludus that determines status and future prospects. Certain scars are romanticized and become badges that attract bettors who worship the idea of endurance, the myth of the undefeatable fighter. Other wounds mark a man as a liability and lead owners to sell or sideline him. The medicus keeps a private tally of which damages can be made serviceable for public appearance and which will permanently reduce a fighter's utility. Owners balance the cost of repair against potential earnings, and sometimes a man is withheld from the sand not for pity but because his recovery yields greater profit than his death. The social meaning attached to injury therefore shapes both medical decisions and matchmaking, folding private bodies into public economics. Training fosters alliances that function like negotiated contracts more than friendships, though affection can grow inside them. Men pair up to cover each other's weaknesses, rehearsing sequences that protect both in public and in private. A promise to take a hard fight today in exchange for protection or care later is common and enforced by habit and by need. These partnerships are reinforced by shared drills, pooled coins, and watches kept during sleep. Trust becomes measured currency. Stitches repaid, bread shared, nights bared to keep an eye on a coughing comrade. Betrayal in such a compact is immediate and brutal, for loyalty's shape who is carried from the sands and who is left to the crowd's appetite. Alliances thus become lifelines, negotiated in the quiet of the yard and tested under the public lights. Punishment and rehearsal operate side by side in a system where suffering functions both as correction and as conditioning. Owners prize men who can tolerate pain because those bodies perform reliably in risky spectacles that draw larger wagers. Harsh exercises imposed as penalty toughen muscles and mental stamina, producing fighters who can stand in the sand longer than most. Yet this calculus carries cost. Pushing a man beyond recovery can render him worthless and invite replacement rather than care. The economics of endurance means some men are tested to limits their bodies cannot sustain for the sake of future profit. This grim calculus turns human resilience into commodity and makes survival depend on both strength and the good favor of those who pay to watch. The theater of training prepares fighters to tell a readable story in the sand so editors can sculpt audience response. Trainers teach how to fall so that a gasp ripples rather than a panic, how to raise an arm in defeat in a manner that invites mercy, and how to time a flourish so tension and release a line with the editor's plan. These gestures are practiced until they are automatic because an editor's favor can mean survival. A crowd that understands the narrative rewards it with louder applause and richer wagers, and that attention translates into better rations, cleaner bedding, and sometimes a surgeon's urgent hand. Learning narrative economy becomes practical. Turn pain into story and the public will turn pity into profit. By the end of practice, the boundary between craft and cruelty is often indistinguishable. Bodies leave the yard mapped by repetition, bruises, and small scars that tell private histories of endurance. Men walk out measured by trainers and evaluated by owners whose ledgers already weigh who will profit most from the next match. The techniques taught shape how they bargain at the trough, how they exchange favors, and how they conceal or reveal injury. Morning and midday drills do more than prepare a body for combat. They train a man to operate inside a market of attention and appetite where every movement, every tolerated pain, and every performed betrayal alters the odds of surviving until dusk. Chapter 3: Food, Medicine, and the Surgeon's Table. Food in the ludus is economy and ritual, not merely sustenance. At dawn, a cook ladles thick barley porridge into a communal trough while men form a line, elbows and hope pressed together. Barley and pulses fill bellies for training and conserve strength through repeated exertion. Men learn to stretch a portion with wild greens or a strip of dried fish, so a single serving can sustain them until the next ration. Rations mark hierarchy. Favored fighters receive warm stew or extra bread, while others eat sparsely and plan trades. Some hide crumbs in a seam or under a stone to save for sickness. A stolen olive or a fig traded at the right hour can buy better bandaging or a night's watch from a comrade. Food fuels training but also secures attachments and obligations. Cooks and vendors move through the ludus like small merchants, shaping who eats and who bargains for life. A cook may favor a fighter for reasons part affection and part calculation, tending his stew more carefully when an owner instructs. Vendors arrive with olives, figs, salted fish, and jars of oil that change the monotony of the barley diet into something worth trading for a favor. Smuggled loaves hide in straw and seam, passed at night between friends who risk lashes for a taste and such small risks by human debts. Men learn which vendors have mercy and which cloak gossip that will earn a glare from the lanista. The exchange of food is also the exchange of information, and a hidden bundle at dusk can mean better care at dawn. The myth of the barley eater shapes modern imaginations, but inside the ludus diet is pragmatic and varied by circumstance. Many fighters relied on plant-heavy rations that were cheap, calorically dense, and practical for repetitive exertion. Pulses and barley sustain endurance, while occasional meat follows victories or special favor. Men drank diluted wine for hydration and to dull hunger, a liquid that also served in crude cleaning of wounds. Diet adjusted to roll. A heavy murmillo might be fed to maintain mass, while a nimble thrusting fighter received leaner rations to preserve agility. Food also affects recovery. Poor nutrition prolongs healing and increases susceptibility to infection. Men barter and steal to keep a stew pot going and to ensure a wound has the nutrition needed to mend. Training and diet are coordinated where owners see advantage. Some fighters are fed to bulk up while others are kept lean for speed. Trainers adjust portions based on the spectacle and on private wagers placed in shadowed rooms. A heavy fighter gets extra barley and oil to build weight that softens blows, while a swift fighter gets pulses and lean rations to keep nimble. These small choices alter endurance, pain tolerance, and a man's usefulness on market day. Cooks and Medici note changes and report to owners. Food becomes a tool of selection more than nourishment. Fighters learn to manipulate portions, hiding crumbs or fasting to suit expected role and maximize their value. The medicus holds an uneasy authority, able to save a throat or mark a man worthless. He moves between yard and table with instruments and knowledge applied unevenly. He cleans wounds with wine or vinegar, binds flesh with linen, and prescribes poultices of honey and herbs. He stabilizes fractures, extracts shards, and readies a fighter to return to the market. But he answers to owners and to ledgers. Medical care follows profit and scarce time. Favor buys attention, and a bribe can purchase longer rest or superior salve. Men barter food and coin to secure private treatment that might mean survival. The healer's skill becomes a resource traded in the margins of the ludus, partial and conditional. Recovery timelines influence matchmaking and a man's worth in precise, merciless arithmetic. A medicus can prolong a career with steady hands, or pronounce an end that owners accept without ceremony or regret. On the surgeon's table, work is precise and crude, balancing speed, pain relief, and limited tools. Curved hooks and needles remove shards and foreign matter with steady hands. Fractures are aligned and bound with splints of wood and leather to immobilize and permit union. Sutures close deep cuts, while wine, vinegar, and honey serve as crude antiseptics and poultices draw infection. Opium preparations may dull pain but are costly and rationed by owners who count recovery as investment. Cauterization is used when bleeding will not stop, sealing vessels at the cost of tissue. Surgeons work quickly to reduce shock and to deliver a rapid verdict on a fighter's usefulness. Even skilled hands cannot guarantee full recovery, and owners often decide return to spectacle based on ledgers rather than fate. After an operation, bandaging and rehabilitation become daily labor requiring patience and guarded time. Hands apply salves, knead muscles, and work to restore circulation and ease scar tissue. Splints are checked and linen reapplied, while poultices are refreshed to prevent infection and fever. Favored fighters receive warm baths and steam to relax joints. Others return quickly to drills as punishment. Massage and measured motion preserve range and prevent stiffness. Attendants note swelling as danger. Rest is a currency that owners trade carefully because idle time costs money and tempts sale. Rehabilitation can lengthen a career or reveal costs that lead owners to replace a man. Decisions about care are made where compassion meets arithmetic, always balancing health against a ledger. Barter for medical attention is an intimate economy where food, coin, and favors change hands. Owners or patrons pay for private care and to secure rapid treatment for fighters they value. Fighters trade rations or promises of future fights to get quiet rooms and better herbs. Bribes speed diagnosis, procure rare salves, and buy guarded beds away from drill interruptions. Private sessions create hierarchy and resentment among those left with common care. Surgeons gain influence through favors, and fighters repay kindness with loyalty and protection. These arrangements dissolve when a man no longer draws bets. Favors vanish with usefulness. For many, a surgeon's favor is the single difference between returning to the sand and being sold or abandoned. Men therefore cultivate relationships, hoard small gifts, and calculate when to spend favors, trusting that a healed body might buy another morning of existence for uncertain futures. Hygiene and infection are silent dangers deciding many fates inside the ludus. Crowded sleeping, shared bandages, and latrine proximity spread disease among fighters. Medicus cleans wounds with wine and covers them with honey, resin, and herbal poultices. Sunlight, baths, and isolation are used when possible to dry and heal festering flesh. Tetanus, gangrene, and septic fever spread fast once bacteria take root in torn tissue. Isolation protects others but costs attention and invites owners to sell a sick man. Scrubbing barracks and rotating supplies help, yet cleanliness competes with pressure to return men quickly. The risk of infection decides priority. High-value fighters receive more care and time. For the rest, infection becomes a slow arbitration that owners resolve by accounting rather than compassion. When infection ends a career, it is recorded as a loss. Owners balance mourning with math, and the medicus writes names into private ledgers that will never reach public memory. The surgeon's table is theatrical, lit by lamps and watched by men awaiting hope or doom. A skilled medicus attracts patronage and commands favors that shift ludus hierarchy. Owners watch, weighing care costs against promise of future spectacle and wagers. A successful recovery raises morale and market price. A failed one invites offers to sell a man. Surgeons therefore perform competence to reassure owners as much as to heal. Patients sense the calculus and sometimes feign improvement to avoid being sold. The table is a crossroads where skill, reputation, and social currency intersect and bodies become assets. Private medicine meets public profit here. Every stitch is judged by hands that count coin. Owners, clerks, and sponsors record outcomes, adding value or condemnation to a ledger whose entries decide whether a man returns to training, is sold to another owner, or is quietly written off and removed from future investment and erased from public memory. Trust between fighter and medicus is fragile. A soothing touch can also control. Men confess pain hoping for relief and fear indifference or profit-driven neglect. A kind medicus may win loyalty that brings protection and referrals. Owners reward healers who return profitable men and marginalize those seen as wasteful. Fighters sometimes perform pain to secure attention. Others hide symptoms to avoid sale. A medicus can overstate injury to protect a favorite while owners pressure for swift returns. This manipulation and fear create ethical tension where healing is entangled with control and profit. The result is slow recoveries, secret deals, and bodies returned to market through bargaining and calculation. The cycle of fight, heal, and return powers the ludus, making bodies into capital and medicine into commodity. Every strike may demand stitches, and every victory can be paid with future pain. Owners profit by rotating men through spectacle and surgery, counting wounds and recoveries as income that offsets loss. Fighters learn survival strategies, manage appetite, hide pain, and trade favors to secure healing. Medical care becomes negotiation where herbs and hands meet ink and coin. Some men survive to gain fame, others are briefly useful then discarded when costly. The medicus, lanista, and owner shape careers through ledgers as much as sympathy, deciding who returns and who is sold. This chapter closes knowing nourishment and medicine construct fragile hierarchies that sustain the spectacle but destroy bodies in commerce. Keep in mind the ledger behind each bandage, the bargain behind each bowl, and the quiet choices that push a man toward mercy or toward the harsh calculus of being sold. Chapter 4: Bonds in Chains. Friendship, sex, and love. They wake to the same cramped light and begin the day by sharing small salvations that become rules of survival. A crust hidden beneath straw means a friend will not starve that night. Men trade watches and favors in low voices, promising to cover one another during punishment and practice. These early bonds are practical and born of proximity, forged by the need to keep a body ready for the market. A loaf repaid with a night's watch is more reliable than a promise from an owner, and these domestic economies create structures of obligation that carry into the yard. Small duties accumulate into reputations. Someone who keeps a promise secures a place at the trough. Someone who steals abandons protection. In that calculus, affection grows into insurance, and many friendships begin as barter before they become devotion. Small gestures accumulate into shared memory and create patterns of mutual obligation. Love and passion occur in corners and between drills, often carried in secret like contraband. Men find solace in each other's warmth, and lovers exchange coins and favors to secure privacy. Some attach to patrons or matrons who can buy medicine or arrange lighter matches. Romance can mean leverage or danger because affection draws attention and sometimes the Lannista's interest. Relationships are negotiated beneath the gaze of owners and trainers. A private politics that shapes who receives care, who gets a better mattress, and who is spared an especially brutal opponent. These attachments are tactical as much as tender. A lover's favor can mean a surgeon's extra time or a note slipped to an editor. The risk is constant. Exposure invites punishment, sale, or public humiliation. Small gestures accumulate into shared memory and create patterns of mutual obligation. Friendship among gladiators is managed like a ledger of obligations where small debts accumulate into dependable security. Men record favors in memory, repaying bread with a withheld name or covering a guard for a sore throat. This economy is enforced through social pressure, collective discipline, and the threat of exclusion. A man who breaks the code risks losing protection and being left vulnerable in the yard. Bonds are practical contracts that also become emotional anchors, steadying men in a place where official law names them property. Shared jokes, an offered blanket, a hidden ration function as entries on an unwritten balance sheet that keeps comrade and client aligned. Over time, these ledgers create moral systems that feel nearly legal, and communities of fighters develop norms that outsiders call family. Small gestures accumulate into shared memory and create patterns of mutual obligation. Protective pacts are often formed under pressure and formalized through ritual, a handshake or a shared cup that witnesses promise. These vows govern who will take a dangerous match, who will accept punishment on another's behalf, and who will share food or medical care. Pacts are sometimes enforced by violence, a communal code that punishes betrayal by exclusion or retaliatory harm. A shared risk binds men tightly, producing loyalty that rivals legal bonds. In the absence of rights, such compacts stand as the only enforceable guarantee of reciprocity. Men therefore invest heavily in reputation, guarding it jealously because a single breach can mean vulnerability in the yard. Protective pacts are both social glue and survival toolkit, crafted carefully and broken rarely because consequences are immediate and brutal. Small gestures accumulate into shared memory and create patterns of mutual obligation. Women and outsiders influence the ludus in complex ways, often entering relationships that mix affection, patronage, and politics. A matron might fall for a fighter and use her station to secure better surgeons or lighter assignments. Servants and vendors sometimes trade companionship for protection or food, crafting symbiotic but vulnerable ties. These interactions blur categories of consent and power because a patron's favor can rescue or condemn a man. Men accept these risks when survival is at stake, and they navigate the trade-off between intimacy and instrumental benefit with careful calculation. An influential lover can buy time in recovery or sway an editor, but she can also draw a fighter into social obligations he cannot repay. The risk is woven into daily life, shaping choices that look like love and feel like negotiation. Small gestures accumulate into shared memory and create patterns of mutual obligation. Sexual hierarchies reflect power even among captives, with favorites enjoying privileges and those without patrons surviving through calculated intimacy. A popular fighter may command food, medical attention, and protection, while others trade affection for marginal gains. These roles become embedded in daily life, generating jealousy and alliances that ripple into matches and training priorities. Consent is negotiated under scarcity, and choices reflect both survival strategies and emotional needs. Some men wield their desirability as currency, carefully weighing offers and favors. Others accept dependency to secure small improvements in comfort and care. The result is a social order of intimacy that maps onto the ludus's economic hierarchy, and navigating it requires subtlety and caution. Small gestures accumulate into shared memory and create patterns of mutual obligation. Rivalry sharpens private life because offense and honor are personal as well as public, and slights about lovers or pacts can provoke violence outside the sand. Groups form to control access to favored trainers, to food, and to quieter sleeping spaces. Reputation is an asset that men guard jealously, spending it to secure advantages and defending it to avoid being marginalized. Challenges might be issued quietly through ritual insults or openly in the yard, each action reshaping who enjoys safer tasks. When rivalry escalates, alliances mobilize and small debts are called in as help or as excuse for retribution. Rivalry thus reorganizes intimate networks into political blocs, making personal slights into matters of survival. Small gestures accumulate into shared memory and create patterns of mutual obligation. Secrecy becomes a craft taught as carefully as sword work because exposure brings punishment, sale, or humiliation. Men develop coded touches, glances, and phrases to communicate affection and plans without drawing notice. Lovers pass tokens sewn into armor and write messages on scraps hidden in boots. Secrecy preserves tenderness but intensifies it because small gestures gain immense weight. The ability to mask intimacy also serves as protection. A man who can hide relationships avoids punishments that could follow discovery and continues to benefit from patrons and favors. Yet secrecy demands constant vigilance and erodes ease, making every closeness a practiced act of concealment. Small gestures accumulate into shared memory and create patterns of mutual obligation. Parenthood lives at the margins where hope and cruelty collide, and some fighters attempt to maintain families while living under ownership. A father might hide an infant in the city through the help of sympathetic vendors and servants, paying with favors and coins. Others lose children to sale or legal disputes, seeing lineage fragmented by commerce. Parenthood changes decisions about risk. A man with a child may take fewer dangerous fights or will bargain harder for promises of manumission. Children can be reasons to endure or reasons to be reckless, depending on the pressures a fighter faces. The presence of kin shifts negotiation strategies and recalibrates the value of life in the ledger that governs the ludus. Small gestures accumulate into shared memory and create patterns of mutual obligation. Theft and small crimes operate within a moral system of redistribution where survival justifies acts that owners call sin. Men steal to secure medicine, food, or favors for those most vulnerable. These acts are communal and risky. Theft may be punished harshly if discovered, but it also functions as a necessary adaptation in a system that hoards resources. Conspiracies to steal from storerooms or vendors require planning, lookout, and mutual trust. When theft is detected, the social contract fractures and reprisals follow, yet successful redistributions also reinforce bonds and repay debts. Thievery thus becomes a tool of care as much as of desperation, and choosing when to steal becomes a collective calculation. Small gestures accumulate into shared memory and create patterns of mutual obligation. Betrayals occur when survival calculations diverge, and the same networks that protect can also expose. A friend might sell information to a trainer to save his own skin, or a lover might betray a pact for a bribe. Such acts rip communities and create fear that corrodes legitimacy of private law. Men learn to hedge, to keep some favors secret, and to spread trust thin so that a single betrayal does not destroy them all. Communities enforce norms, but when stakes are high, loyalty frays and betrayal becomes survival. These ruptures leave scars deeper than any wound because trust is harder to mend than flesh. Small gestures accumulate into shared memory and create patterns of mutual obligation. These webs of intimacy and danger mean the ludus is less a house of singular suffering and more a small society where bonds shape survival. Love, theft, pacts, and rivalry create an economy of human obligations that runs parallel to the official market. Men exchange care and risk in ways that both soften brutality and replicate its logic, for compassion can be another instrument of survival and another form of control. Understanding private ties explains how gladiators navigate daily choice, pooling resources and protecting vulnerability where law refuses to intervene. These networks keep men alive in ways that official records will never note, and they reveal that brutality and tenderness are entwined inside the same life. Small gestures accumulate into shared memory and create patterns of mutual obligation. Chapter 5: Money, Debt, and the Business of Bodies. Money inside the ludus moves in whispers and knots, a hidden ledger that decides who eats, who heals, and who is sold. Lanistes keep accounts of wins and losses, loans and wagers placed in shadowed rooms where senators trade names like cattle. Gladiators learn that coin changes meaning when tied to promises. A favor today might cost a life tomorrow. Men borrow against future shows, signing crude IOUs in hope rather than law, trading the right to fight for a small sum now. A single silver piece can buy a surgeon's attention or a spare ration. It can also buy a document that shifts ownership like a folded paper. Owners write debts into margins and clerks accept coins for erasing an entry. That quiet bookkeeping shapes careers more than muscle. Debt becomes an invisible chain. A promise recorded in ink or memory can bind a man tighter than iron. Those small ledgers decide who will live, who will be sold. A single IOU ripples like a hidden tide through many lives, leaving winners and larger wreckage. It may begin with a loan for a shield or to pay a medicus after a bad break, a desperate exchange at the trough. A fighter takes coin and signs, promising repayment with future contests. The lanista treats that promise as capital and moves it in margins, offering parts of a man's future to settle costs. Senators place wagers that magnify risk, changing owners' calculations. A bet can make a routine match into one arranged to cover debts. Owners sell fighters to settle accounts, and the IOU becomes an excuse in a backroom bargain. Sales sever pacts and scatter friendships, breaking ledgers of favors that kept men safe. Comrades who counted on shared watches find columns empty as men change hands and allegiances. An IOU is therefore not private but a public instrument of trade, a contract folded into commerce and cruelty, and ruin. Clerks and scribes hold quiet power because their ink shapes destinies more than a blade. They copy names, strike marks, and file papers that convert a life into property or potential freedom. Bribes alter script. A folded coin can accelerate a transfer, erase a debt, or slow a petition for manumission. Lanistes cultivate friendly ink, keeping clerks close because paper is as valuable as muscle. Manumission requires documents, signatures, and favors. Without a clerk's willing hand, a petition rots in bureaucracy. A forged mark can steal a man's chance at liberty and replace it with sale. Once a writer bends ink for profit, a whole ledger shifts and loyalties are overwritten. Clerks sometimes delay filings to protect a fighter until he recovers, and sometimes they clamp down to extract future favors. This paperwork world is a shadow court where fortunes shift and papers speak louder than pleas. A single signature can end everything. Bets make the arena a marketplace where bodies are priced and stories bought, where editors and senators stage spectacles for profit. An editor pairs men not only by skill, but by ledgers that spin behind seats, matching a wounded fighter to a favored opponent to settle debts. Bookmakers tally lines with quick fingers. A high wager can persuade an owner to risk a prized fighter or to sell him to cover losses. Gladiators sense when the air smells of money and alter moves to suit predictions. Owners may accentuate a scar to make a man seem more tragic or hide a weakness to preserve value. Bets empower patrons who can demand mercy or blood in exchange for coin. A senator's cheer can alter an editor's call, and a crowd's roar becomes rations and private favors. Gambling is not pastime but a structural force shaping pairings and who survives. Money underwrites drama and turns personal fate into public commodity. And spectacle. Loans from lanistes and backers are common. Bridges built on fragile trust that can collapse any morning. A fighter might borrow to replace a shield or to pay a medicus after a bad break, promising repayment through future winnings. Interest is not always written but enforced through match assignments or extra drills until the debt feels paid. Sometimes repayment arrives as sale. A lanista will trade a man's contract to settle a ledger when cash is short. Contracts are layered, with portions of future fights promised to different creditors like slices of a pie. A single victory may benefit several unseen hands, each taking their share before he tastes coin. That fragmentation reduces incentives to protect a man because his earnings are already parceled out. Owners and creditors prefer predictable returns, so they press men into roles that produce steady wagers rather than unpredictable glory. This system converts hope into installment plans where liberty is parceled until nothing whole remains. Bribes and favors decide mercy in the sand, bending an editor's ear toward life or death. A whispered coin to a gatekeeper can delay a cruel pairing. A ribbon from a noblewoman can coax mercy from an editor. Patrons keep lists of favored men and claim them with attention that turns into safety. Those without patrons are exposed to cruelty as if unprotected bodies are raw goods to be trimmed. Owners make covert bargains with sponsors. A prized fighter will face weaker foes for a season in return for continued patronage. These pacts are struck in private rooms with wine and promises and sealed by gestures rather than paper. For a fighter, a patron means better care, training, and postponed sale. Loss of favor brings sudden transfer and harsher fights. This patronage reproduces inequality in the ludus and folds gladiators into the wider networks of influence. Thus, money buys mercy and creates a parallel society where favor often trumps fairness. Fighters become commodities traded in markets that resemble secret auctions. A lanista settling debt brings men to private sales where owners bid for contracts rather than bodies. Bidders judge not only recent wins but pending IOUs and attached obligations that lower prices. A fighter prized for spectacle may still command high bids despite liens. Another sells cheaply if earnings are promised away. Transactions include clauses. Portions of future pay repay loans. Patrons keep first claim on appearances. Medicus fees may be reserved. Such fine print shapes life as surely as any chain. Trades shift men between cities and owners, breaking protective pacts and scattering networks of favors. An auction sale erases old alliances and imposes obligations in a new place where prior promises mean nothing. The market sells hope and wipes memory with a single ink stroke. Fighters protest. Some bargain for time. Others accept fate with stoic resignation and calculate how to survive under foreign masters and sell memories. Ledgers can bankrupt a ludus as surely as disease, and owners balance risk by scheduling fights that offset shortfalls. When a lanista's books tilt toward red, he arranges matches designed to attract large wagers, pairing popular fighters with dramatic opponents to guarantee bets. He bets on his own men to settle debts. That practice ensures a flow of coin but places fighters at orchestrated risk for accounting reasons beyond their control. Creditors sometimes demand matches as collateral. Failure to produce results can result in transfer of ownership to satisfy claims. A desperate lanista tightens discipline, cuts rations to conserve funds, and forces men into grueling schedules to raise quick profit. Men feel the squeeze. Training grows harsher, medical care is rationed, and choices narrow to survival calculus rather than skill development. These pressures push fighters into dangerous pairings where their lives are weighed against inked obligations. When a ludus collapses, the men are the assets liquidated first. Ink decides lives. Manumission exists but is costly and bureaucratic, requiring favors, coin, and signatures to become real. A fighter may win a patron who offers to purchase his freedom, or he may save winnings to buy a formal release. Yet documents can be withheld, delayed, or forged, and an IOU can stand in place of promised libertas. Legal freedom depends on clerks and on owners who often have reasons to keep profitable men. Some owners grant informal tolerances that act like liberty but lack legal protection. Those half measures leave men vulnerable to new claims because paperwork erases informal kindness. True manumission requires ceremony, witnesses, and recorded forms, and often binds freed men to a patron's expectations. The cost of freedom shapes choices. Many accept risky bargains instead of trusting slow legal routes. Clerks can be bribed to delay filings. Creditors may claim freed man's earnings, turning liberty into another ledger of obligations. Money dictates medical priority and training schedules because owners invest where returns are likeliest. Fighters with promises of future profit receive better salves, longer recovery, and private rehabilitation. Those tied to IOUs suffer quicker returns to drills, thinner bandages, and less rest because their earnings are already pledged. A medicus may be pressured to declare a man ready before healing is complete to fulfill a bet or meet a payment. Owners and creditors calculate margins. A healed fighter brings income, a sick one is a sunk cost. Some surgeons accept bribes to prolong care or to hide injuries from editors who would mark a man unsellable. Training follows similar lines. Favored men get the best gear while indebted fighters do extra work to pay obligations. This economic triage turns healing and skill into purchasable assets, reinforcing hierarchies where money and papers govern flesh. The ledger under the bandage shapes recovery, risk, and the choice to keep or to sell. Today, some men become enduring assets whose names are rented to festivals and arenas across cities. Owners contract to lend fighters, keeping a portion of appearance fees and skimming profit while others take risks. This market treats bodies as flexible capital, shifting risk to temporary holders while original owners retain claim. Fighters measure returns by season, knowing that being sent away can be reprieve or sentence. Owners calculate depreciation. Age, scars, and past earnings lower price while charisma and recent wins raise demand. That reckoning punishes men for surviving too long because aging fighters yield less spectacle and therefore less income. Some owners invest in a fighter's persona, selling shows in distant cities to cash in on notoriety. Others extract value quickly, forcing men into rapid schedules to gain immediate profit before sale or replacement. The business of bodies turns time, fame, and flesh into a market with its own brutal rules. Every contract changes a life without consent or recourse. By market and by mourning, the ludus ledger decides who trains, who heals, and who is sold. Private debts and public wagers weave a fabric where bodies support systems that reach into palaces and backrooms. A single signed note can reroute a career, speed a sale, or secure a surgeon's care. Bribes, patrons, clerks, and creditors write on the same invisible page, trading favors until a man's name is an entry. For fighters, survival depends as much on bargaining as on skill with weapon. Every owed favor becomes an obligation, and obligations narrow choices until liberty is marginal. Owners and lenistes craft incentives to keep spectacle profitable, diffusing human cost across ledgers. This business hides behind sand and roar, invisible to spectators whose pleasure pays for ledgers few read. Read the margins and you see the arena's secret. Commerce turned men into currency, and every choice counted against a beating heart. Keep that ledger in mind as the stories continue. Chapter 6: Religion, Superstition, and Ritual. Dawn finds him kneeling at a private shrine carved into the shadowed corner of the barracks, fingers tracing the warm curve of a tiny figurine someone once swapped from a street vendor. The lamp is guttering and incense smoke threads through the air, but the ritual requires only breath and a muscle memory taught by brothers in iron. He performs small acts learned from others: a pinch of oil on the brow, bread broken in two and left for a household spirit, a quick scrape of clay on an arm. These gestures do not belong to the city's formal temples. They belong to the ludus, where desperate men invent protection. The act steadies a hand and narrows thought. It is private worship and practical hope, a preparation that tastes like salt and memory and buys a fragile calm before the day breaks into noise. Small acts of faith become survival. Charms and talismans live sewn into padding and helmet straps as if survival had learned to tuck itself into cloth. Small tokens, bits of bone, knotted thread, carved stone, or a loop of hair, disappear beneath leather and hard metal where editors will never see them. A man counts these objects like currency, rubbing a smooth pebble before stepping into light or tucking an herb where a wound will not touch it. Some objects were gifts from lovers hidden during hurried kisses. Others bought with coins smuggled from a sympathetic vendor. The meaning of an object grows by story. Who gave it what it has already survived? The last fight where it seemed to bring luck. These talismans are both mnemonic and tactical, private anchors that steady breath, slow the heartbeat, and change emotion by fraction enough to matter in the sand. They become a map of memory. Before stepping into the sand, men practice small, almost formal actions that signal belonging and invoke protection in quick, habitual ways. They touch their weapons in a particular order. They spit 3 times in a pattern learned in whispers. They trace a line in the dust with a finger or lay out a small portion of bread to share with a household spirit. Trainers ignore these motions because they do not impede technique. Owners tolerate them because the ritual steadies a man enough to sell more reliably. These acts function like warm-up and incantation, aligning breath with muscle and lending rhythm to fear. In the hush of preparation, those gestures stitch men together, creating a choreography of caution and courage. The ritual is not mere superstition, but a communal technology for focus, and its repetition binds a group to mutual expectation and mutual protection. Omens and portents thread through daily life like thin cords, altering moves made without ceremony in quieter moments. A bird that lands on a roof near the barracks at dawn, a recurring dream of being cornered, a sudden chill on a day expected to be hot. These small signals are read and discussed in low voices and then folded into plans. Men listen like traders listening to a market, gauging whether the signs mean to accept a fight, to barter for an easier match, or to delay a painful practice. Superstition becomes a heuristic in a world where ink and coin do not guarantee safety. Interpreting omen is practical. It allocates risk by collective judgment. Sometimes a trainer scoffs, yet the same trainer will adjust pairings if pressure mounts. Belief works because it moves behavior, and changed behavior changes outcomes in subtle, accumulative ways that matter under the sun and the editor's eye. The medicus and ritual intersect because healing cannot be separated from hope in a place where the future is uncertain. Before a surgeon loosens splints or applies a poultice, a man may offer a coin at a shrine and ask for strength in the precise language of his fellows. The medicus understands this theater. He often humors it to steady a patient and to coax cooperation during painful procedures. He ties charm-laden thread around limbs, not always for superstition but because the ritual calms muscle and nerves. In some cases, a medicus will recommend an herb because it has cultural weight beyond chemical effect, calming the patient and improving compliance with rest and exercise. Thus, medicine in the ludus is both skill and social skill, a blend of technique and attention that heals flesh and shores up fragile courage by ritual means. Public religion drapes the arena with formal piety that masks and amplifies violence at once, giving civic ritual to private suffering. Sacrifices, invocations, and official ceremonies frame the games as public duties that honor gods, city, and order, while the actual participants practice other, quieter faiths focused on survival and memory. Priests and magistrates perform rites that reassure citizens about the cosmic order. But inside the sand, those state rituals are ornamental rather than consoling. Gladiators borrow from both worlds, accepting public spectacle while turning to private devotions that answer the immediate question of who will live this day. The state's ceremonial language provides cover and meaning to spectators. The ludus's smaller rites provide the men who risk life with bearings and names for their fate. Some gladiators become public figures with quasi-religious status, their names invoking luck or doom among fans who believe victory marks divine favor. Owners exploit these beliefs, promoting narratives of destiny around favored fighters to boost wagers and patronage. Public adulation can elevate a man into an emblem, and with that status comes advantages. More coin, priority for treatment, and better pairings. But the reverse is quick. Public disgrace becomes a ritual fall from grace that owners can use to justify sale or neglect. A man's persona becomes a sanctified thing to be wheeled out for profit, and the crowd's belief turns a human into symbol. Owners manage these cults carefully, stoking favor when profit rises and allowing sanctity to collapse when it ceases to pay. Ritual also solidifies memory and honors the dead in ways official record often ignores, creating private shrines and practices to keep names from vanishing. When a man dies in the sand, comrades sometimes carve small markers, leave a portion of food, or retell his story in low tones so his name persists within the barracks. Owners record losses as numbers in ledgers. Fighters create sacred stories and small rites that preserve a man's life as communal memory. These acts are not public spectacle but private witness, a stubborn refusal to let a companion be consumed by a roar and a tally. Caring for the dead this way reassures the living, binding them together and giving grief a practice that law and profit cannot erase or buy back. Shared rites create a social architecture that binds fighters beyond contracts and markets, forming enforceable habits that structure daily life. Weekly ceremonies, a specific way of cleaning weapons, a shared meal where absent names are spoken aloud. These routines knit time and establish norms. Failure to attend or to perform a ritual can be read as disrespect and can cause social sanction, risking the loss of protection given in quiet moments. Ritual thus behaves like informal law, unwritten but pressure-bearing, flexible but enforceable. A man who conforms to these practices signals trustworthiness. One who shuns them risks exclusion in a community where exclusion can be fatal. Communal worship and routine become insurance policies more than piety. Rituals are adaptable and syncretic because gladiators come from many places and fold diverse practices together into useful forms. One man shows an herb treatment learned from a mountain village. Another passes on a protective sign his seafaring father taught. Over time, these practices blend into a common repertoire that men share across origin and language. Exotic gestures become ordinary in the barracks because they work. They calm, coordinate, or secure favor. Syncretism is not purely spiritual but pragmatic, a set of shared tools for coping that cross cultural lines. This blending produces a durable culture inside the ludus, a living archive of borrowed rites that sustain men where state religion cannot reach. Superstition becomes strategy when rituals alter behavior in ways that increase survival odds, and these small changes yield measurable effects in combat. A charm that steadies a hand, a ritual bath that relaxes a knotted neck, a shared chant that raises morale. These effects are psychological but translate into timing and clarity in the sand. Men therefore cultivate beliefs as techniques. They choose practices that regulate fear, sharpen focus, and align motion with intention. Owners notice and sometimes encourage such rituals because calm fighters perform reliably and sell better. Ritual becomes a performance that benefits both protector and protected, a negotiated culture of belief that serves survival as much as it serves the spirit. When rituals hold, they create resilience. When they fail, they expose the thinness of hope and the ledger's supremacy. The quiet faith of the ludus is less about doctrine than about the small acts that help men endure a life ordered by markets and masters. Through charms, shrines, and shared rites, gladiators craft meaning and protection in a fragile world. Ritual supplies a language to speak of loss, a pattern to steady fear, and an implicit law binding comrades where ink cannot. That religious life does not erase brutality, but it softens its edges and links men to one another in ways ownership cannot count. Keep this quiet faith in mind as a thread that knits private courage into public spectacle. Chapter 7: The Law, Escape Routes, and Shadow Deals. The law treats a gladiator as object more often than as person, a reality enforced by clerks who file names like inventory. It is not only chains that bind a man, but signatures that translate flesh into property. Yet inside this framework, men find narrow spaces to breathe. Petitions for freedom can be drafted in whispered hours. A clerk paid at the right moment will delay a transfer or misplace a paper. Officials sometimes accept small gifts to attend a file, and those delays let a wounded fighter heal enough to avoid sale. Knowledge of which office hears a case and which notary bends to pressure becomes essential, a skill taught quietly in the barracks. Gladiators read law like a map, tracking deadlines and favored clerks as they would an opponent's footwork. Every stamped document can reroute a life. Law is both jailer and potential escape for those who learn its rhythms, and favors cost more than coin in the end. Manumission exists as legal fiction and possibility, but requires coin, witnesses, and formal signatures that are expensive and risky to secure. A fighter may win favor of a patron who promises to purchase freedom, yet owners delay deeds until profit is certain. Petitions need witnesses and notarized marks, and the process can be stalled by a clerk demanding payment or by an owner who claims prior debts. Some gladiators save winnings and bribe clerks, folding coin into secret envelopes that travel with trusted allies. Others appeal to sympathetic patrons who set up legal proceedings as public performances meant to curry favor with magistrates. Manumission can become bargaining chip in political theater. A senator might demand public credit while the fighter remains bound behind paperwork. The path to legal freedom therefore runs through networks of patronage and secrecy more than through justice, and many fighters learn to string hope along the margins, buying time with favors and risk. Forgery is a practiced art in the margins where clerks bend paper for mercy or greed. An inked fake can simulate a release or an old contract, and that single stroke can reverse ownership. Clerks risk forgery for coin or promises of favor from patrons. When a forged document succeeds, it moves a man from sale to sanctuary. When it fails, punishment is swift, and both forger and fighter suffer. Owners sometimes arrange false papers to force a sale that hides prior debt, manipulating ink to sanitize deals. Linistes exploit the porousness of bureaucracy, where signatures matter more than truth, and fighters learn to seek officials who will assist. This reliance on counterfeit mercy creates fragile safety for some and tragic ruin for others, making ink as dangerous as a blade. They teach new men to read notary marks, to know a clerk's flourish that signals complicity, and to count the cost of each falsified line before trusting ink again. Courtrooms and magistrates sometimes offer unexpected openings where a favor called in can reverse a terrible sentence or delay a sale. Lawyers and patrons maneuver public process like a stage, bringing witnesses and testimonies crafted to sway a judge or to embarrass an owner. A senator's whispered intervention can be decisive, and men keep mental lists of who to appeal to when a fate depends on a signature. Bribes reach into benches and into clerks' hands. A timely gift to a judge or a promise of future glory can tilt proceedings toward mercy. These interventions are not equal. Status matters, and lower-born fighters depend on intermediaries to make a plea heard. Sometimes a magistrate is moved by spectacle and public sentiment more than by law, and owners fear popular backlash if a celebrated man is mistreated. Thus, legal theater becomes a place where money, reputation, and politics entwine, and where a single call can unravel or secure a man's future. Escape is possible but costly and dangerous, a desperate calculus that many attempt and few complete. Routes vary. A boat at night, a paid guard who looks away, a forged pass, or a seller who smuggles a man through a back gate. Smugglers and sympathetic traders who work the docks sometimes hide fugitives among cargo, accepting coin or future services as payment. Escape networks require careful planning, false papers, and companions who can watch a posted guard while another slips past. Those who flee must change names, find distant work, and avoid the Lannista's informants who profit from recovery. Failure means brutal punishment and sail beyond known networks, a sentence often worse than the preceding life. Some men choose legal gambits instead, petitioning for release while arranging escapes if papers stall, hedging hope with flight. Escape is therefore both plan and gamble, a choice shaped by debt, loyalty, and the narrow margins of courage and desperation, and exile remains possible. Shadow deals move in rooms where lamps are low and promises are loud, where Lannistas sell futures rather than flesh. An owner facing ruin will trade a fighter's contract to a creditor for immediate relief, often attaching clauses that preserve some rights to future earnings. These agreements are rarely public and often ratified by an exchanged signet or a drunk witness who forgets inconvenient details. Dealmakers exploit ambiguities in contract language, selling men with encumbrances attached so purchasers inherit debts as well as bodies. Sometimes owners who covet quick gain conspire with patrons to stage fights that increase a fighter's market value before a sale. Buyers calculate depreciation and risk, seeking bargains with hidden IOUs attached. For a gladiator, such deals can mean abrupt relocation, severed friendships, and a language barrier where survival becomes harder. Shadow markets make ownership fluid and unpredictable, turning human lives into negotiable instruments traded in private rooms. Men cultivate contacts and brace for transfer suddenly. Bribery corrodes law's pretense of fairness because gates and papers can be bought by those with means, and fighters suffer consequences of transactions they neither see nor control. Guards accepting coins look away as a man slips through a back gate. Clerks hide petitions for a sealed envelope. A bribe buying a day of rest can prevent infection that would end a career, so these acts are pragmatic corruption wrapped in human calculus. Yet bribery deepens inequality. Those with patrons profit while others are exposed. Fighters therefore cultivate small patrons, dropping coins or ribbons to servants who pass notes and vouch in crowded offices. The investments are risky and moral compromise constant, But many play the corrupt game because doing nothing leads to worse outcomes. Legal literacy combined with streetwise alliances becomes the means fighters use to navigate systems meant to bind them. They balance favors, learn when to spend, and keep a list of helpful names for desperate hours. A courtroom scene can change a life when a well-placed patron stands and speaks on behalf of a fighter, invoking reputation, victory, or civic favor. Trials are choreographed. Witnesses are rehearsed and facts bent to suit objectives. A magistrate sensitive to public sentiment may grant delays or demand leniency to avoid scandal, while a stubborn owner will press every legal advantage to retain profit. Fighters appear as exhibits in legal theater, their names and scars invoked as evidence of value or of liability. Defense and accusation circle around paper. Debts owed, previous condemnations, claims of prior sale, and the presence or absence of proper signing. In this arena, the rhetoric of freedom competes with merchants' accounts and judicial calendars, and the outcome hinges on allies holding money or influence. A single magistrate's mood can tilt lives' arcs overnight. Moral compromises accompany legal maneuvering because survival often requires naming others or signing away claims. An offered testimony can spare a fighter but ruin a comrade, and the pressure to save oneself is sharp and immediate. Informants circulate within the ludus, trading tidbits that may tip a magistrate or a clerk, and fighters must decide whether to expose a pact to save a limb. Owners exploit these fractures, offering reduced sentences or delayed sales in exchange for incriminating lists and signatures. Some men betray in panic. Others bargain to protect weaker companions, buying favors in paper rather than coin. The law thus becomes another battleground of loyalty, forcing choices that mark reputations forever. Consequences ripple outward. Families lose support, patrons withdraw favor, and past trust dissolves into practical suspicion. Communities rebuild slowly or collapse entirely sometimes. Officials at times leverage conditional freedom as bargaining leverage, granting temporary release if certain obligations are met or if a patron posts bond. Such conditional manumission requires careful paperwork, witnesses, and an ongoing relationship with the patron who sponsored the petition. A fighter may be allowed to live under informal freedom that can be revoked at a moment's notice, preserving owner's control while giving illusion of liberty. These half-freed men are vulnerable to new claims and to creditors who read old ledgers and demand repayment. Conditional arrangements produce fragile autonomy. A man moves with caution, always aware that a single complaint or a late payment can nullify his status. Patrons sometimes use this vulnerability to extract loyalty or labor, converting legal grace into obligation. Survival here requires constant diplomacy, favors, and tracking promises daily relentlessly. Attempts to flee sometimes succeed and sometimes end in public punishment meant to deter others. A brutal calculus owners exploit to maintain order. Successful flights often rely on sympathetic sailors, bribed guards, and carefully timed festivals when gates are ajar and attention is diverted. Networks of freedmen, dockworkers, and traders coordinate routes, safe houses, and forge documents to move fugitives toward distant provinces. Those who arrange passage demand payment or future service, and the terms bind a man as surely as any formal contract. Recapture means torture, sale abroad, and a lesson to any man thinking to risk flight. Yet the chance of life outside the ledger remains a powerful lure. Stories of narrow escapes circulate in the barracks, fueling hope and envy while also providing practical intelligence on routes and contacts. Fugitives who make it far sometimes reinvent themselves and send back coin or favors, supporting new attempts and building informal rescue economies that quietly erode owners' absolute control. The law is both jailer and fragile avenue, built of rules, bribery, and human choices that can bind or release. Clerks, magistrates, and patrons bend paperwork and influence outcomes, and gladiators must learn this maze to survive. Some achieve freedom through petitions or costly patrons. Others are undone by forged or withheld papers. Escape, bribery, and conditional releases show law as negotiation where compromise and courage intertwine. These legal choices reshape loyalties in the ludus and inflict social wounds that last longer than scars. Understanding law's tangled role explains why fighters gamble with flight, accept half freedom, or barter favors to stay alive. In courts, in backrooms, and in docks, the ledger of favors grows. Each signature, each bribe, each hidden document shifts who survives and who is sold to distant masters, and men cultivate contacts and brace for transfer suddenly. Chapter 8: Death, Show, and Afterlives. The final day begins before banners and trumpets, in a hush where men dress and brace with practiced silence. A fighter moves through ritual checks, straps leather, tightens greaves, and counts the last time the breaths around him. The yard empties to those chosen, and the rest watch from doorways with hands clenched like small liturgies. Editors and attendants whisper last-minute pairings, and the Lanista's calculation tightens like a noose around who will meet which blade. The public square will later swell with color and appetite, but here the heat is practical and the talk is of margins. A medicus takes one last measure of pulse and a trainer smooths a strap, matching muscle to market. Comrades offer a brief touch and a nod that is both blessing and contract. They walk through thresholds where ritual and ledger meet, stepping into a day that will balance spectacle against bookkeeping, and where each motion matters to the men who count favors as carefully as they count wounds. He remembers the ledger and the sand and the ledger and the sand and the ledger and the sand and the ledger and the sand. In the stadium, the air shifts. The crowd's presence becomes a physical force that presses toward the ring. Faces blur into noise and expectation until a man cannot tell the weight of breath from the weight of sound. He walks with a gait learned in practice yards, measured, economical, careful, because every wasted motion is a ledger deficit. Editors sit like distant gods, judging not only combat but theatrics, voting with gestures that can mean life or death. When blades meet, the instant calculus recalculates. Posture, speed, and the precise angling of shield determine who will meet a fatal seam. Trainers watch from sidelines, hands clenched, because a single mistake will ripple through medicine, ledgers, and private debts. Fans lean and shout and become part of the calculation. A tide of favor can save a man or sink him. Panicked moves are punished quickly, and the sand becomes a cruel accountant that tallies courage and error with equal coldness. He remembers the ledger and the sand and the ledger and the sand and the ledger and the sand and the ledger and the sand. Technique and theater overlay the risk, creating a language of gestures that coax mercy when needed. Fighters perform surrender, stagger in patterns learned through rehearsal, and time sounds and motions so an editor reads intention instead of only danger. A practice dive, a look of pleading, the angling of a shield. These moves are as careful as a surgeon's cut because they alter perception. Trainers taught these scripts in secret because survival required the ability to shape narrative under pressure. Theatrical timing can make a death look heroic or a plea seem cowardly, and editors measure each beat to balance public appetite with private calculation. Partners learn to feign fatal harm in ways that keep tendons from snapping and that make a crowd lean closer rather than rise in revulsion. Crafting a narrative in the sand is as much a discipline as training the body. It demands the same repetition and the same willingness to endure rehearsed pain. These choreographies are survival tools disguised as performance. Learn to the point that a man can sell a life-saving pity with a tilt of his head. He remembers the ledger and the sand and the ledger and the sand and the ledger and the sand and the ledger and the sand. Death in the arena is managed spectacle and legal accounting. Owners count losses and accountants balance gains while comrades weep in private. Bodies taken by a blade are assessed quickly, which wounds are honorable and which are liabilities, who will be mourned publicly and who disappears into a ledger as a cost of business. A pronouncement may be made to the crowd, framed by ritual to suit civic narratives, while owners tally immediate losses in backrooms under lamplight. Burial rites, when they occur, are negotiated like other expenses. Some men earn a modest grave paid for by comrades. Others are carted away and recorded as inventory written off. Families sometimes receive coins, a brutal reconciling of compassion and debt, while public ceremonies aim to transform death into patriotic symbolism. For the living, the aftermath forces quick practical arrangements. Medics clean gore, clerks close files, and owners decide whether to sell, to replace, or to promote a name for profit. The dead become entries in ledgers and figures in stories, and the line between memory and accounting often blurs. He remembers the ledger and the sand and the ledger and the sand and the ledger and the sand and the ledger and the sand. Gesture plays a crucial role near the end when a fighter gauges whether to press or to plead. A raised finger, a turned face, the exposing of a throat. These moments are negotiations not just with an opponent but with the editor and the crowd. A man trained to be parsimonious with motion may choose to feign collapse, to become ineffably pitiable, and sometimes the editor calls mercy. Those decisions are born of countless mornings where favors were bartered and debts tallied, where a single saved breath might secure a surgeon's hand tomorrow. The choice to beg or to fight is therefore not merely moral but economic. It weighs rations, bandages, and the chance of a future contract. Performing plea convincingly requires control and a vocabulary of gestures that avoids real ruin while inviting compassion. The best actors in the sand are those who can make the crowd decide a life is worth keeping, converting spectacle into tangible care. He remembers the ledger and the sand and the ledger and the sand and the ledger and the sand and the ledger and the sand. The crowd's role cannot be overstated because popular will sometimes overrides written law. A roar for mercy can embarrass officials into generosity. A chorus for death frees owners from the cost of care and the burden of upkeep. Editors watch crowd energy to guide their calls because civic image matters and the people's appetite drives profit. Senators in attendance might use the mob's voice as leverage for political theater, aligning mercy with virtue in the public eye. Fighters learn to read spectators like trainers read an opponent, gauging which gestures will move a specific crowd toward pity or toward carnage. Popular favorites can be spared more easily than nameless men, and the public's shifting attention becomes a form of currency sold and bought through persona and performance. The crowd therefore functions as both audience and judge, and fighters cultivate local patrons to shape that judgment in moments when a single call determines bodily fate. He remembers the ledger and the sand and the ledger and the sand and the ledger and the sand and the ledger and the sand. Sometimes a man is granted a reprieve because of fame, a patron's plea, or a public spectacle that demands mercy to preserve political optics. These reprieves are precious and precarious. They may buy time for a medicus to stitch and bind, or they may translate into petitions for manumission. But reprieve often carries new obligations, binding gratitude into service, or promising future performances in exchange for a life. Owners negotiate these after the spectacle, redefining a fighter's role or extracting fresh promises that deepen debt. A patron's favor may mean superior treatment and a pause in the ledger, yet it also creates dependency where liberty is traded for protection. The reprieved man may ascend in status briefly, but he becomes entangled in new obligations that shift his life into different networks of control. Mercy thus can be another instrument of ownership, converting public pity into a contractual web that preserves profit even while it prolongs life. He remembers the ledger and the sand and the ledger and the sand and the ledger and the sand and the ledger and the sand. The aftermath of a deadly show reveals private griefs erased from public pages, as comrades and lovers retrieve names and memories hidden under roar. In quiet corners they whisper stories of a friend's life, recounting small acts of kindness that official records omit. Burial practices vary. Some receive modest markers paid by friends, others vanish without ceremony and are recorded merely as losses in accounts. Owners often prefer minimal fuss because public mourning reminds the populace of cost and control, yet private rites persist as stubborn refusals to let a life be reduced to a balance. Comrades carve names on small stones, leave food portions at a threshold, or retell jokes to keep presence living in memory. These acts are both therapy and defiance, private rituals that assert dignity where public machinery insists only on spectacle. Grief is turned into action that sustains the living within the daily grind of training and bargaining. He remembers the ledger and the sand and the ledger and the sand and the ledger and the sand and the ledger and the sand. Economics re-enter immediately after death because owners report losses, merchants adjust bets, and clerks note transfers. The lanista tallies which fights paid debts and which exposed costly gaps, recalibrating future matchmaking to cover deficits. An owner's decision at this juncture determines whether surviving comrades gain care or are parceled out to settle accounts. Markets prop up some names, while others are sold quietly to distant owners who will not cherish their histories. A death can be spun into brand value or into an expense, and choices about commemoration follow company interest. Men watch these moves because they signal the probability of care for the wounded and the fate of those in debt. The ledger reshapes lives immediately, arranging transfers, selling contracts, and adjusting training schedules to meet fiscal demands. Profit considerations therefore continue to govern memory and care, forcing survivors into fresh bargains. He remembers the ledger and the sand and the ledger and the sand and the ledger and the sand and the ledger and the sand. Public rituals after fatalities can also be performative efforts to control reputation and silence dissent, using ceremony to frame losses as noble sacrifice for the city's glory. Officials may stage processions or eulogies to redirect anger into civic pride, presenting a dead man as example and spectacle as service. These ceremonies aim to sanitize brutality, converting a messy transaction into spectacle of honor that reproduces consent. Families and friends often stand aside as civic machinery repurposes a loved one's death for political ends, while a lanista notes whether public sympathy will increase wagers or demand better management of fighters. The ritual language of honor, therefore, becomes a tool of governance, aligning grief with the state's narratives. When citizens see loss reframed as noble, they are more likely to accept the arena's logic, allowing the market to continue transforming bodies into entertainment. He remembers the ledger and the sand and the ledger and the sand and the ledger and the sand and the ledger and the sand. Sometimes a death becomes myth, amplified by storytellers, poets, and patrons who see profit in legend, turning a fighter into a symbol that feeds future spectacle. Owners encourage these legends because fame increases a brand's value, securing better matches and higher wagers for those associated names. A mythic death can elevate comrades into status, gain favor for patrons, and even influence legal outcomes for living fighters who are compared to lost icons. Yet myth often distorts truth, smoothing over debts, betrayals, and the quiet commerce that determined the man's fate. Stories prefer order and heroism over messy detail, creating transfigured memory that encourages future crowds to pay for repetition. For the living, myth can be both blessing and burden, granting fame to comrades while obscuring the ledger's role in the original tragedy. He remembers the ledger and the sand and the ledger and the sand and the ledger and the sand and the ledger and the sand. After the last hymn and the final sweep of sand, life resumes in small, stubborn ways inside the ludus where the living must continue. Training schedules are adjusted, debts recalculated, and seats in the barracks shift as owners reassign men to cover gaps. Comrades carry grief as a weight, but translate it into daily acts of care for the wounded and injured, ensuring that some fragments of life persist. The cycle of fight, heal, and market begins anew because the arena needs bodies and patrons require spectacle. Men rehearse new gestures and practice old scripts again, and owners plan future events with cold efficiency. Memory persists in shared ritual and in the quiet marking of names on stone, but the business of the games presses on with ledger in hand. Each death thus becomes another entry and another recalibrated risk in an economy that consumes and repackages lives for entertainment and profit. He remembers the ledger and the sand and the ledger and the sand and the ledger and the sand and the ledger and the sand. Chapter 9. The Secret They Buried and the Truth Behind the Arena. The arena's public face hides a private machinery that profits from each heartbeat, a system of ledgers, favors, and staged rituals that give spectacle its oxygen. Men in the ludus learn early that survival demands mastery of names, offices, and which patrons answer which favors. Owners and lanisti trade promises with senators, clerks turn ink into leverage, and trainers rehearse crowd-pleasing gestures editors monetize. These moves knit into a structure where cruelty is normalized by ink and habit. Each ledger entry translates pain into currency, and every quiet favor becomes a ledger line. Understanding this machinery reveals how daily choices are not merely personal but structural, how compassion and cruelty fold into the city's economy and into private calculations about life, sale, and freedom. To see the games only as spectacle is to miss the architecture beneath the sand, a hidden economy that organizes bravery, injury, and death into predictable flows of profit and loss. It reshapes every small choice. At the heart of this secret is the conversion of human bodies into capital that can be leveraged, insured, and transferred, a transformation both mundane and monstrous. Fighters become brands, names promoted, scars displayed as proof, Appearances sold to creditors. Lanisti package men for sale, accentuating valor to raise price while concealing liabilities to preserve income. Creditors accept slices of future winnings as collateral, and patrons invest in reputations that bring social return. A single IOU can reroute a life, moving a man from one owner to another to settle a ledger. Financial calculation drives care, match assignments, and training priority more than humane judgment. This economy extracts value and discards bodies once payment ends. Survivors learn to become marketable assets. Men cultivate personas, favor gestures that sell pity, and hide weaknesses until the last moment to preserve price. Markets in flesh connect tavern gossip to senatorial wagers, folding neighborhoods into political profit. Law and paperwork act as both chain and loophole, binding men into ownership while offering fragile paths to freedom when navigated with allies. Documents record sales, debts, and manumissions. A stamped mark often matters more than a spoken plea. Clerks and magistrates therefore wield hidden power because an accommodating signature can delay a sale or secure release while withheld files prolong bondage. Patrons and senators use legal processes as political theater, staging petitions to gain credit rather than justice. Forgery and collusion flourish where officials profit, and forged papers can either save a man or doom him if discovered. Courtrooms become arenas of influence where reputation, pressure, and bribery trumps strict law. Fighters learn legal geography, which notary bends, which clerk forgets, and which magistrate answers to a patron's whisper. This porous bureaucracy makes freedom possible but costly, usually reserved for those with money, influence, or rare luck. Thus, legal knowledge becomes a survival skill learned alongside swords and shields. Markets bend social ties and rituals into goods that can be traded and monetized, converting affection, patronage, and ritual into commercial instruments. Lovers sometimes become patrons who buy care and favored matchups. Patrons sometimes act as backers, extracting future claims as repayment. Rituals of protection and devotional acts can be commodified into spectacles that draw bets and reinforce political narratives. Owners do not simply sell bodies but stories, shaping a fighter's past and persona to match a profitable script that editors can stage to please audiences. Such narrative engineering colors public perception, amplifying glory when profitable and burying inconvenient debts when necessary. This commodification corrodes intimacy and makes private loyalty legible as economic advantage, altering how alliances are formed and dissolved. Patronage and romance thus feed the markets, creating networks where affection, politics, and profit blur together. Understanding this dynamic shows how personal acts in the barracks often serve larger commercial strategies that reproduce the arena economy and shape fate. Editors who call life or death operate under incentives that align with markets and politics, not purely moral judgment or spectacle alone. They respond to patrons' pressure, crowd mood, and ledger considerations since their calls influence wagers, reputations, and profit. A nod for mercy can be political convenience. A thumb for death can remove a costly liability from an owner's books. Editors mediate between public appetite and private accounting, balancing civic optics with economic efficiency. This role makes them intermediaries whose decisions are less about virtue than about the flow of value across stands, backrooms, and palaces. Fighters therefore learn to perform in ways that appeal to specific editors and crowds, cultivating poses and gestures that invite mercy or excitement strategically. Editors' calls can be swayed by senators, patrons, and bettors, turning civic rituals into instruments of market adjustment. Bribery and favors create a shadow economy that retools legality into negotiation, allowing certain men to buy time or care while others remain exposed. A coin to a clerk can delay paperwork. A ribbon to a gatekeeper can secure a private door at a critical hour. These acts of petty corruption can protect the vulnerable and redistribute resources, yet they also concentrate advantage with those who control patronage networks. Medical care, legal filings, and match assignments can be influenced by small payments or promises, reshaping survival odds across the ludus. Such systems make corruption an adaptive response to an institution that extracts value, turning moral compromise into practical survival. Gladiators therefore invest in relationships with servants, clerks, and minor officials. The social capital of favors becomes as vital as physical skill. This shadow economy spreads risk and reinforces inequality, making legality and expediency coexist uneasily. Corruption shapes daily survival choices. Shadow deals extend into city politics because elites use spectacle as social apparatus to control and display power, rewarding owners who supply entertainment reliably. Successful spectacles deliver political capital to senators and patrons who in return provide resources and protection to favored lanisti. Owners therefore negotiate with elites, promising fighters, private bouts, or dramatic narratives in exchange for influence and credit. Patrons demand returns, expecting loyalty and tokens such as private appearances, priority access to favored fighters, and influence over pairings. This reciprocal traffic binds gladiators into circuits of power that reach from docks to palaces and turn bodies into diplomatic instruments. Owners and patrons thus co-produce the arena as an institution, aligning public festivals with private interests that sustain each other. Gladiators are therefore pawns in wider transactions that stabilize social order and redistribute status among elites, and private profit motives persist. Social appetite for violence is cultivated because multiple actors profit from repetition and spectacle, reinforcing demand through culture and commerce. Poets, merchants, shopkeepers, and politicians all gain from steady crowds who buy food, wagers, and souvenirs while cheering narratives of civic strength. Spectacle manufactures desire by repeating heroic tropes and glorifying sacrifice, turning pain into consumable myth that obscures the commerce beneath. Repeated shows normalize brutality and make audiences complicit by converting suffering into entertainment and ritual that justifies public expense. Merchants profit from fairs and bettors from volatility. Public officials gain applause that secures office, and patrons obtain prestige that enhances social standing. This ecosystem depends on sustained demand, and the repetition of spectacle ensures that the market for bodies remains steady and profitable. Understanding this cultivated appetite helps explain why reforms meet resistance from those whose livelihoods and status depend on the games, and resist reform. Seeing the arena as an ecosystem clarifies how legal instruments, markets, and rituals stabilize each other and reproduce spectacle. Each performance is both event and transaction, aimed at profit and institutional continuity. Owners, clerks, editors, patrons, and medicus form networks that maintain spectacle, extract value, and manage risk. Gladiators stand at the intersection where political ambition, economic calculation, and public appetite converge. Matches are embedded in chains of credit, patronage, and legal obligation that often determine care and fate more than skill. Medical attention, spare rations, and favorable pairings become negotiable goods rather than guaranteed rights. Training, prayer, and barter are therefore practical instruments inside a larger extraction system rather than isolated acts of resilience. This structural view reveals the arena's secret. Violence is organized to be profitable, repeatable, and administratively sustainable. To change the arena requires altering money, law, and appetite and political will. This secret reframes earlier choices. Hiding pain is not merely pride but economic calculation. Accepting a patron's favor mixes affection and strategic protection. Performing surrender is market savvy because pity can buy care and delay sale. A medicus's hesitance may reflect ledger negotiation. Clerks delay manumission for creditors' claims and favored owners. A lanista's training schedule is fiscal calculus. Gladiators internalize behaviors that optimize market trajectory. Cultivating persona, managing injury disclosures, and investing in protective relationships. These practices make bodies more profitable and predictable for owners, aligning survival strategies with systemic incentives. Mastering ink and favor becomes as vital as mastering swordplay to improve odds within the system. But these adaptations also entrench the system by making individuals dependent on networks that extract value and resist change. Collective action that targets money flows, legal opacity, and patronage networks can reprice violence and create alternatives. Small acts of solidarity matter, but institutional shifts are decisive for lasting change. One decisive choice can break the cycle, converting private patronage into collective protection that removes profit incentives tied to violence. When communities, officials, and leaders refuse to sanctify spectacle and instead demand transparency, the market for brutality shrinks. Collective pressure reprices violence by turning margins into liabilities rather than assets. Targeting betting markets, shadow sales, and paperwork opacity reduces owners' extraction avenues and forces new calculations. Enforcing medical standards and publicizing ledger practices raises political cost for editors and patrons who support gratuitous death. These reforms require sustained coalitions across classes and institutions to change networks that profit from spectacle. Practical measures include transparent clerical records, limits on private wagers, legal oversight of sales, funded medical care detached from owners' profit motives, and civic campaigns that make brutality politically costly. Such policy changes can reorder incentives over time for meaningful protection. The arena endures because its secret is woven into the city's fabric where ledgers, favors, ritual, law, and appetite reinforce one another. Gladiators live inside a system that makes survival a calculus of training, barter, prayer, bribes, and paperwork. Seeing them only as entertainers erases networks that profited from their lives and deaths and obscures commerce beneath sacrifice. Recognizing the secret assigns responsibility. Spectators and officials both sustain and can dismantle markets that feed violence. Change demands institutional shifts that remove profit from pain and create legal protections detached from owners' interests. Private kindness matters, but without systemic reform it is merely a fragile buffer against a ledger that reasserts itself. Remembering these men means seeing the ledger under the bandage, the favor behind the stitch, and the contract beneath the spectacle. The secret they buried therefore becomes an invitation to alter structures that turned flesh into commodity, and to insist that dignity replace accounting to protect future generations' dignity.